The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Democratic presidential hopefuls were full of sound and fury, but what did it signify? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Round 3 of Democratic presidential debates feature heated debate over health care, attacks on the frontrunner, vicious attacks on President Trump as a white supremacist, and a growing ideological schism between Joe Biden and the rest of the field. We'll break down the high and lowlights for you and consider the basic question of what, if anything, the debate might have changed. And with climate change hysteria again on display on the debate stage, we'll bring on our go-to guy on all things environmental, Pat Michaels, to examine the left's claims that the planet is in a death spiral. LibertyNation.com editor-in-chief Lisa K. Donner joins us to discuss bold attempts by the dying newspaper business to stay afloat and the question of whether we should take extraordinary measures to keep newspapers alive. Plus, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza jumps on board for Talkin' Liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We commence the proceedings with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out an assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians in the chattering class. As sure as summer turns to fall, so do presidential primary debates eventually transform from polite discussion of issues to carefully planned offensives on their chosen targets, whether they be their brothers or sisters on stage or the incumbent president, especially the incumbent president.
You've spent the last 2.5 years full-time trying to sow hate and division among us.
We have a white supremacist in the White House.
And he is treating our farmers and our workers like poker chips in one of his bankrupt casinos.
And now, President Trump, you can go back to watching Fox News.
Sure, we got the usual railing against the deplorable president, but what else is new? The real news coming out of round 3 of Democratic debates Thursday night in Houston were the heated exchanges over health care right out of the gate that set a decidedly more contentious tone than in the first 2 rounds. Senator Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders defended the damn bill, Bernie's own words, that Bernie authored, which would end private health insurance in favor of a single-payer, government-run system, Medicare for all. Frontrunner Joe Biden repeated his pledge to protect and expand Obamacare and drew a sharp distinction between his plan and single-payer, and may have had a moment when he continued to fend off Bernie's aggressive defense of government-controlled health care like in many other countries.
My plan for health care costs a lot of money. It costs $740 billion. It doesn't cost $30 trillion. How are we going to pay for it?
In the United States of America, we are spending twice as much per capita on health care as the Canadians or any other major country on earth.
This is America.
This is America. Old Joe sounded almost like Trump there for a moment. And you can bet the rank-and-file Democrats out there getting scared to death of all these socialist programs certainly noticed. Now, Biden later actually called Sanders a socialist as opposed to Bernie's own moniker of Democratic socialist. But the front-running former vice president continued to be a punching bag for much of the evening, as you'd expect, clinging to his affiliation with the nation's first black president to fend off the attacks of lower-tier candidates like Julian Castro.
He wants to take credit for Obama's work, but not have to answer to any questions.
I stand with Barack Obama all 8 years, good, bad, and indifferent. That's where I stand.
And you know, Biden was hardly alone in praising his former boss, evidently stung by criticism of their tepid defense or complaints about President Obama's policies in the previous debates. Many of the candidates poured on the praise for Obama this particular night almost as often as they attacked President Trump for being a racist and white supremacist. Senator Kamala Harris even attempted to revive the 2008 slogan, "Yes, we can." But there's also the matter of Joe Biden's age, 76. And in one of the nastiest, most personal attacks of the night, Mr. Castro took dead aim at the target.
Are you forgetting what you said 2 minutes ago? Are you forgetting already what you said just 2 minutes ago?
Now, if you thought that naked attempt to depict Biden as a doddering old fool was bad, consider the words of one Beto, don't call me Robert Francis O'Rourke, former congressman and child of privilege who's been renouncing that privilege throughout the campaign. He was once thought to be the next big thing before fading badly in the previous debates. And after declaring that Trump is a white supremacist who inspired the mass shooter in El Paso, Beto went on a diatribe about gun control, concluding with this not-soon-to-be-forgotten promise.
Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47.
Yep, President O'Rourke is coming for your guns. What could go wrong? There were very few memorable new ideas put forward in this third debate, but you got to hand it to Andrew Yang, the tech entrepreneur who proposes to give every American over 18 $1,000 a month in what he calls a freedom dividend. And Yang said he's putting his money where his mouth is right now.
My campaign will now give a freedom dividend of $1,000 a month for an entire year to 10 American families.
So Yang can get another burst of publicity in a year when the results of his experiment come back. Pretty clever. So what's the upshot of this third debate? Biden often smiled at the wrong time and, as is his wont, stumbled frequently, but seemingly without much consequence. He continues to stand by himself in this field as the lone non-progressive, hard as he tries to sound like one at times. His lead would appear to be safe for the time being, but in delivering a third consecutive strong and at times commanding performance, Elizabeth Warren could be on the verge of expanding her advantage over the perpetually infuriated Bernie Sanders and establishing herself as the undisputed leader among the field's many progressives. And if you missed the show, worry not. There's 9 more debates scheduled before the Democratic nomination is settled. And one more clip for you, and it's serious food for thought. A statement by the respected veteran congressman and third-ranking Democrat in the House, James Clyburn, decrying the many in his party looking to tear things down instead of building them up. And then listen to how he concludes.
But I do not agree with pulling things up by the root. You go and try to build upon what you've done. You know what? I really believe sincerely the climate that we're in today, if the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the United States Constitution, were put before the public today, I'm not too sure that we will hold on to the Bill of Rights.
I want you to ponder that question as you go about your lives this week. If the Bill of Rights was up for a vote today, would it actually pass? This is a question we have to ask circa 2019. Quick break, and then we're back to discuss whether it's worth extraordinary measures to resuscitate the dying newspaper business.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Where can you find honest political commentary with sobering analysis, accountability, deconstructing threats to our liberty, and boldly reporting the truth? Subscribe to LibertyNation.com YouTube channel, where facts matter.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, your local newspaper. These have, for well over a century, been a central part of American culture. Did you see the front page of the paper today? What did the paper say about the presidential debate last night or the game last night? And what page is the crossword puzzle on? But in an age where digital media is king, newspapers, print editions are gasping for air, increasingly on life support, needing the subsidies of the digital side of their operations to carry on. So, is it worth extraordinary measures to save our dying print newspapers? Or should they be allowed to go the way of the horse and buggy when the automobile was introduced? Joining us to consider this question is the editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com and author of a truly thought-provoking piece on LN this week entitled, Hat in Hand, the Boys on the Bus Are Begging for a Government Handout. And, oh yeah, she's also my better half. And you, dear listener, have no idea how true that actually is. Lisa K. Donner.
Oh, I'm touched.
Yes, I can see that all over your face. Now, I love the opening line of your story about the newspaper business. If you can't beat them and you can't join them, then by all means, regulate them. Explain what that means regarding the newspaper business.
Well, the title is a little misleading. They're not exactly asking for a government bailout. They're really asking for some government regulation. That's really what newspapers are looking for. Basically, there is a coalition that's come together. They've met with legislators. They're trying to even the playing field a little bit. According to the Pew Research Center, in 2018, weekday print circulation, this is just print, decreased 12%, and the Sunday print circulation decreased 13%. So the digital world is hitting newspapers hard.
What do you think we're talking about in terms of a time frame? I mean, I think everybody thinks that newspapers are dying. It's a matter of time. Is it a 5-year frame, a 10-year frame? Will we have just the legacy papers like the New York Times, Washington Post, and others? When will we no longer see a newspaper available for purchase?
Well, I do think there is room for them to maneuver, and they have maneuvered over into the digital world. Many of them get a ton of hits on digital media. The problem is that so much of their hard-earned work, and I know this as editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com, other people monetize your work. So, for instance, we don't carry ads currently on our site, but other people carry our articles and they carry ads. So they're essentially monetizing our work.
Yes.
And so really what the newspapers are saying, they have a case to make.
Well, they do. And you've been in the media most of your adult life. You've been a reporter, an anchor, a producer, an executive producer, executive in your own video production company, you and me. And we've relied on newspapers for enjoyment and also to provide the details on stories that we're interested in and cover. But now, with the role of digital media, newspapers on a virtual death watch as they fade into obscurity and are overtaken by technology, really. Are newspapers worth saving because of their historic or intrinsic value? Or are they dinosaurs that should not be saved, much like your old Windows 8 computer when Windows 10 came along?
Well, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's an and I do think they can move into, and they are moving into the digital world without a doubt. But here's another reason for them to dislike President Trump. It's the soaring cost of newsprint. According to the Chicago Tribune, the price of paper driven by federal tariffs imposed by the Trump administration on Canadian suppliers is slamming newspapers at a time when the industry is already hurting. So they're kind of getting it from both ends.
Is that a legitimate criticism of the president?
Probably. I think that there are some hard times ahead with tariffs because nothing's been done for such a long time. And sometimes we just have to suck it up and to bring other people to the table like he's doing with China and whatnot.
There does seem to be some validity to the assertion that tech giants like Google profiting handsomely off the work of newspapers. They pay nothing for it, and they reap untold billions in profits from the hard work and huge expenditures of newspapers. That they should have to pay for the privilege, just like you and I have to pay to download a song that an artist has spent millions to produce. On the other hand, newspapers charging Google for use of their content could take us down a pretty slippery slope and will certainly result in higher prices for consumers or endless ads carpet bombing your computer even more than now. Which of those arguments is more convincing, do you think?
Well, let me just say this, that the platforms, the digital platforms, Google, Facebook, etc., they are using headlines, they are using articles, they are using excerpts. For instance, we had one organization who said they would print an excerpt for us because they were a bigger digital organization, and that would give us some advertising on their site. The problem was that their excerpt was 650 words out of a 720-word article. That is not an excerpt.
No, it is not.
And I sort of feel for the papers. My point in the article really isn't that they're wrong. My point in the article is that I don't think it's going to work.
Neither do I. Of course, we're in the digital media business, you and I, with LibertyNation.com. But if we stop and look at the broader view, I mean, newspapers are remarkable things. As you think about all that goes into creating a newspaper, which covers the entire world every single day, do you find it as remarkable as me?
Well, I know your father finds it remarkable. He's been doing the New York Times crossword puzzle every Sunday.
And he still continues to read the New York Times, even though he rails on a daily or hourly basis about its palpable left-wing bias. Thanks for joining us, Lise.
Thank you, Tim.
That is Lisa K. Donner, editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com. We'll break away for a moment, then come back to examine the claims of the end-of-the-world crowd that the planet Earth is in a death spiral.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Exhausted by all the fake news? On LibertyNation.com's YouTube channel, facts and fresh, bold analysis are what you get without the leftist spin. Subscribe today to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel because
Truth
is
making
come back.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Existential threat, the eve of destruction, Armageddon, the end of the world as we know it. Watching that Democratic orgy of climate change alarmism, climate catastrophe on CNN last week was enough to make you want to just end it all. So we bring in the man we usually turn to when this climate change hysteria gets particularly out of hand. He's Pat Michaels, Senior Fellow in Energy and Environment at CEI, the Competitive Enterprise Institute. and the man who most effectively debunks the climate change hysteria, which has now metastasized into a central issue in the Democratic presidential primary. Pat, welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio.
Great to be with you.
Great to have you back. It's been too long. Now, let's get right to this 12-year thing. We're 12 or 11 or 10 years or whatever each of the candidates says, away from this sort of end-of-the-world scenario. That's the amount of time we have before the end of the world is nigh. On what basis do they make this claim, this 10, 11, 12-year thing, and how valid is it?
It's an exaggeration of a claim made by the United Nations that if the nations on Earth, this was made in 2018, did not be on a path to substantially reduce emissions and to go to zero emissions by the year 2030, that it would be impossible to avoid a very negative impact from climate change. Now, they didn't quite exactly say that, but somehow the 12 years between 2018 and 2030 was conflated into saying that the world's going to end. We're going to go into climate apocalypse in 12 years unless we do something. No, that's a real exaggeration of what that was all about.
Well, now here's something I completely don't understand in what environmental activists claim. They say that this climate crisis will produce all manner of catastrophes, including both floods and droughts. Now, I don't understand how you can say both droughts and floods would result from the meltdown of the global climate. Can you explain that to us?
Well, it's kind of difficult because, you see, as noted by the famous philosopher of science, Karl Popper, if a theory explains everything, then it explains nothing because it can't be tested. And there's a very strong aspect of that in much of the rhetoric on climate change. Every time there's a hurricane, every time there's a tornado, every weather event,
right,
somebody gets online and says, this was caused by climate change. Well, you can't have it that way. And in reality, the changes that we see are really subtle. For example, about hurricanes. There have been model projections that hurricane rainfall rates might increase some. But according to those projections, the signal of that is not likely to emerge out of the noise in the data until somewhere around the year 2080. And, when you start talking about things that far in the future and trying to plan for things that far in the future, you may actually be doing a disservice by spending money now on futile attempts to stop things you can't.
Now, we have enough trouble trying to predict the weather next week, but oops, I forgot. Weather and climate are different, and we'll get to that. But here's another thing, Pat, that we get lectured on by the environmental extremists, especially when we ask why, for example, we got record low temperatures across the Midwest last winter down to like minus 30 degrees when we're in the midst of a global warming crisis. And that is, you don't understand. There's a difference between climate and weather. So, Pat, what is the difference?
Well, generally, weather events are just that. Events that last a few days or so, individual storms, etc. Climate is a summation of all those events over time. Obviously, climate is very multidimensional, and that's why you just can't take an individual weather event and attribute it to climate change.
Now, I'm trying to figure out with this Green New Deal business how basically shredding the entire American economy and starting all over again with a Green New Deal, and let's call it what it really is, a fantastical, all-encompassing socialist manifesto, when there are approximately 190 or so other countries in the world who will not live by the same standards. How's that going to save the planet? I mean, if we did the whole Green New Deal, the whole thing that the squad and most of the Democratic presidential candidates are demanding, would it actually make any difference if we're the only country out of almost 200 in the world that's doing this? And conversely, what difference would it make if every country on the planet did do a Green New Deal?
Well, let's try the first one. Let's say that we cut our emissions to zero today, and we don't emit another molecule of carbon dioxide from the United States all the way to the year 2100. The Obama administration had a model to project the climate effects of various policy options, and you can run that model under those circumstances. In other words, our emissions go to zero today, and they stay there till the year 2100. Using the climate models that the Obama administration was very fond of, it turns out that zeroing our emissions to the year 2100 would reduce global warming by about 1/1400ths of a degree Celsius.
Okay, there you go.
1/1400ths of a degree.
There you go.
Now, you can't measure that because from year to year, the year-to-year variability in annual surface temperature is about 11/100ths of a degree Celsius. So how are you going to find the 1/1400ths of a degree signal when the noise of the data is very close to 1/1400ths?
Now let's turn the question around, Pat. Are there any benefits to a planet that's warming as opposed to cooling or stable?
Well, that's a question that has been turned around in the economic literature for quite some time. And my understanding of all this is that a modest warming is a net benefit, according to these economic models, up to about 2 degrees Celsius or so. That's because we can see some of the things we're doing already via satellite data. The planet is much greener than it was when we started measuring planetary greenness in the late 1970s from satellite. And the areas that are growing the most, that are getting the greenest, are the areas that everybody was so scared about, which happen to be the tropical rainforests of Africa, South America, and East Asia. So that's good news. This was all initially written up in a paper by Zhu et al. That appeared in Nature magazine in 2016. And they found that almost 80% of the global greening was a result of the direct fertilization effect of carbon dioxide that we're putting in the air. Another small percent was nitrogen deposition. That also comes from stuff that we put in the air via agriculture and land use change. And it turns out that human activity is responsible for around 90% of the observed planetary greening.
That is Pat Michaels, Senior Fellow in Energy and Environment at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and he'll address several other catastrophic claims by environmental activists when we conclude our discussion with him next week. Meantime, quick break, and then we're back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we have reached the portion of Liberty Nation Radio which we entitle Talkin' Liberty, which is, of course, self-explanatory, as is the brilliance of our regular contributor, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, constitutional lawyer, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
Okay, let's jump right in. Great stories this week. Not always great for liberty, but interesting stories that you don't get almost anywhere else, such as the FBI's infamous list of known terrorists being ruled unconstitutional.
Well, it was a big victory week, the September 11th anniversary week for the Council on American Islamic Relations, Tim, who were behind this lawsuit. They sponsored it on behalf of 23 American citizens, all Muslims, who were on the FBI terror screening watch list of known terrorists, which grew to over 1 million people since it was first started after the September 11 attacks. And the thing about it, Tim, is how do you get on that list? Well, we're not quite sure what the criteria are to add somebody to the list. How do you get off that list? Well, we're not quite sure how do you get off that list. So if you're an American citizen who's been placed on that list, Tim, you can't fly like a normal person. You can't conduct your life like a normal person. And the judge here says, an individual's placement on the database does not require any evidence that the person engaged in criminal activity, committed a crime, or will commit one in the future. So it's basically a damning indictment about an American where they have no due process rights at all.
What constitutes a known terrorist? What's the definition, the FBI definition, the federal government's definition of a known terrorist?
Well, you can never get that out of them, right? Like, how exactly does a person come to be placed on the list? And the truth is there are people who are authorized to place people's names on this list, and they do so. And that's part of the reason why they have to remove it, Tim, is because of this sort of lack of any kind of due process or rigorous vetting.
Well, now, this all comes at the same time that we're talking about passing red flag laws, which would basically target people without evidence or without clear, hard evidence that they would be stripped of the right to own a gun.
When they're estranged lovers and spouses call and complain on them. That's the evidence that's required with a red flag law. So there is some evidence. I would call it biased and tainted, most likely, and that's why we need robust due process rights to be enforced. So if you're making the case that we're going from retreating from one area where there's a lack of due process and engaging in another, I would have to agree with that wholeheartedly.
Now, I'm interested in your take on this next story. California temporarily banning face recognition technology on police body cams, something that you and I have long supported.
There's an interesting component to the law that kind of adds a wrinkle. They're also banned from using facial recognition after the fact. So it's not like you or I might think, perhaps, it's not a good idea to have police walking down the street and them scanning every face that they come in contact with, like, that's a criminal, that's not. Look out, because, of course, it's going to lead to a lot of false positives and the sort of surveillance nation. But what's an interesting component is they're also not allowed to use the facial recognition technology later on. So, meaning like it's a week later, and there's a hot sheet out for a suspect that maybe robbed a bank, and the cop says, did I run into him at the convenience store last week? He looks familiar. Well, they can't go ahead and try to match that up in a computer fashion. So there is an impediment to law enforcement that I think the public may actually want here, but to the extent that they're protecting privacy, this is a 3-year ban on the use of this technology. And I think it's a good idea generally for governments to not let the police decide for themselves how they will implement technology to those of us who are the policed. It's a good idea for our leaders to decide, the elected leadership. And so for that alone, I think it's a positive development.
Now, California has just approved statewide rent control, which sounds like something which would benefit the poor and maybe does benefit the poorest of the poor, but also targets the middle class because rent control traditionally, which sets a ceiling on the rent of certain places, then tends to jack up the prices elsewhere, often to an extreme measure.
I think that the only people you could say it benefits is the poorest of the poor who are already in a decent place to live. That's about it. Because for the rest of the poor, what it does is tighten up supply massively. Why would you build a new apartment complex? You know how expensive it is to develop a new apartment complex in the state of California today with just the current, in other words, yesterday, right?
Well, they do it out of the goodness of their heart.
Right. And so to add to that burden is to say we don't want more inventory on the market. And, of course, that's part of the massive problem that they have in California is that the laws are so restrictive on development that new inventory can't come to market. So you combine that along with the generous social welfare benefits and the pleasant weather, meaning if you're going to be, if you really are, if you have a choice on where to be homeless in America, you wouldn't want to choose, Wisconsin because of the winter, right? You'd want to go to California. So those are the things that add up. And I think Tim, it's just the wrong signaling. You talk about often too, one-step thinking. The rent is too high. Well, we'll just pass a law to make it.
They can't go any higher.
They can't raise the rent.
No consequences from that.
As a New Yorker, that's probably the city that has the most rent-controlled properties.
Indeed.
I think what we know it results in is dilapidated structures and a further repression of freedom in the marketplace. People, they don't move like they would or should. You don't take that job across, a chance in another town because you're going to give up this rent-controlled property. It chains you to it.
And we've known this for years. I mean, we have decades of experience with rent control, and we know that what you just said is exactly what happens in virtually every instance that you put rent control broadly into an urban area. Now, let's talk Supreme Court for a moment. They have allowed nationwide enforcement of the Trump asylum rules, something the president predicted they would do after the Ninth Circuit predictably would strike it down.
So there's a bit of a back and forth on this. I'll try to make it as quick as I can. The administration enacted a rule that basically said if you want to apply for asylum, you have to do so in the they expect asylum applicants to act like asylum applicants rather than migrants. And what that means is if you're in the southern part of Central America, the first safe place you get to is where you would apply for asylum. That is Mexico, legally speaking, not to pick the ultimate destination of your preference, right? If you're fleeing a fire, you just go into whosever arms is closest, right?
And that's a critical distinction.
Yeah. So the administration wanted to change those rules so those people would not be applying for asylum at our southern border. They did so. A judge issued a nationwide injunction against it. That ruling was appealed to the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit then said, well, it's a okay ruling for the Ninth Circuit, but we're not going to apply it nationwide. So in California's and Arizona's border that are in the Ninth Circuit, the injunction would apply, but not the entirety of the United States. The administration appealed that ruling to the Supreme Court. As that appeal was in the works, the Ninth Circuit said to the lower court, the only reason why you can't apply that injunction nationwide is because the facts that have been developed in court don't justify it, but they could be. So that lower court judge had a proceeding in which those facts were, in fact, produced to justify a nationwide ban. So then that original decision was amended to include a nationwide ban, and that nationwide ban was approved. The Supreme Court said...
Say that 3 times fast.
Okay, then it's in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says... In a 7-2 ruling, Justice Sotomayor dissented from the ruling and wrote a dissent, and Justice Ginsburg signed on to her dissent. But all the other justices said that there will be no injunction unless and until we, that is to say the Supreme Court, weighs in on it again. So where it's now going to go is to the Ninth Circuit for the facts of the case. Again, this was just this was a stay. Okay, and then an emergency application for the state. In fact, so it's going to be a while before there's some movement on this case. But for the meantime, that's the current state of the law, and it will be unless and until the Supreme Court itself decides that it won't. So in this issue, just like it has happened with other issues, I think we've talked about it before, a district court judge won't be able to make national law based on their understanding of a disagreement with administration principles.
Another one of these things that seems so obvious that one obscure judge can affect the fate of the entire nation, but once again, the Supreme Court has to clarify.
And something that happens a lot now in the Trump administration, and we didn't see this before.
Indeed. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue, all available to you on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. and we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.